The sound of leather hitting canvas echoed through Iron Fist Boxing Academy like a war drum, relentless and rhythmic. In the corner of the gym, near the dusty punching bags that had seen better days, Maria Santos swept the floor with methodical precision. Her movements were measured, almost meditative, as she navigated around the scattered equipment that littered the training space. To everyone at Iron Fist, Maria was invisible. Just another middle-aged cleaning lady who showed up at dawn and disappeared before the serious training began. But what they didn't know was that Maria's hands, the same hands that gripped that worn mop handle, had once been insured for $2 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Santos arrived at Iron Fist Boxing Academy every morning at 4:30 sharp, 2 hours before the first fighters stumbled through the doors reeking of ambition and yesterday's protein shakes. Her beat-up Honda Civic, held together by determination and duct tape, always claimed the same parking spot behind the dumpster, where nobody would notice the rust eating through the wheel wells or the passenger door that required a specific combination of lifting and pulling to open properly. The keys to the gym hung heavy in her weathered hands as she unlocked the front entrance, stepping into the familiar darkness that smelled of sweat, determination, and broken dreams. Maria moved through the space like a ghost, switching on lights that revealed a world she had once dominated, but now only observed from the margins. The gym itself was a testament to faded glory. Posters of former champions lined the walls, their faces yellowed with age and cigarette smoke from the office, where Tony Marcello conducted his business between training sessions. The heavy bags sagged from chains that creaked with each impact, their surfaces worn smooth by thousands of punches thrown by fighters who believed they were destined for greatness. The ring in the center of the room dominated everything, its canvas stained with the blood and sweat of countless sparring sessions and amateur bouts. Maria's routine never varied. She would begin by mopping the locker rooms, where testosterone-fueled conversations echoed off tile walls covered in motivational posters that proclaimed things like, "Champions are made here," and "Pain is temporary, glory is forever." The irony wasn't lost on her as she cleaned around the benches where fighters sat and boasted about knockouts they had delivered and title shots they were certain awaited them. Her cleaning uniform consisted of faded blue scrubs that had seen better decades, sensible shoes with non-slip soles, and a baseball cap that she pulled low over her graying hair. At 52, Maria had the kind of face that people look through rather than at, unremarkable in the way that made her perfectly invisible in a world that only paid attention to youth, power, and potential. The fighters who trained at Iron Fist represented every level of the sport, from weekend warriors who thought they were tougher than their desk jobs, suggested to serious amateurs with legitimate aspirations of turning professional. They came in all shapes and sizes, united only by their absolute certainty that they understood combat better than anyone else in the room, especially the cleaning lady who disappeared into the background like wallpaper. Tony Marcello owned Iron Fist with the kind of swagger that came from having been a decent middleweight 30 years ago, before his chin went soft and his reflexes slowed to the point where younger fighters started landing shots that used to bounce off his guard like raindrops. He had parlayed his modest boxing success into a gym that attracted serious fighters, wannabes, and everyone in between. Tony treated Maria with the casual dismissal reserved for service workers, acknowledging her presence only when the trash cans overflowed or someone complained about the state of the bathrooms. The real star of Iron Fist was Derek "Thunder" Thompson, a light heavyweight with genuine professional aspirations and the kind of natural athleticism that made everything look effortless. Derek had turned professional 2 years ago and was building an impressive record against increasingly competitive opposition. His training sessions drew crowds of admirers who hung on every combination he threw, every word of wisdom he dispensed between rounds. Derek carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously hurt in the ring, never been dropped by a punch he didn't see coming, never experienced the kind of defeat that rewrote your understanding of your own limitations. At 28, he possessed the dangerous combination of genuine skill and unshakable belief in his own invincibility. His knockout power was legitimate, his record unblemished, and his future seemingly unlimited. The other fighters at Iron Fist orbited around Derek like planets around the sun, absorbing his confidence and basking in the reflected glory of training alongside someone who might actually make it to the big time. They listened to his stories about sparring with former world champions, his predictions about when he would get his first title shot, and his theories about what separated true fighters from pretenders. Maria observed all of this while remaining completely invisible to the ecosystem of ego and ambition that thrived within the gym's walls. She mopped around their feet while they shadowboxed, cleaned the mirrors they admired themselves in, and emptied the trash cans filled with protein bar wrappers and energy drink bottles that fueled their dreams of greatness. The culture at Iron Fist was aggressively masculine, built around the unspoken hierarchy that placed active fighters at the top and everyone else somewhere below. Women were tolerated as long as they stayed in their designated spaces, either as ring card girls for the amateur shows Tony promoted or as girlfriends who appreciated the primal display of masculine power without trying to participate in it themselves. Maria's presence challenged none of these assumptions because she represented no threat to anyone's sense of superiority. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged woman who cleaned up after people more important than herself, invisible and irrelevant to the serious business of combat sports. Her quiet efficiency was taken for granted the same way. Fighters assumed the lights would work and the water would be hot in the showers. The dynamic began to shift on a Tuesday morning in October when Maria arrived to find Derek and three of his training partners engaged in a heated discussion about a recent professional fight they had watched on television. The conversation revealed the depth of their ignorance about the technical aspects of boxing, their analysis colored more by machismo than understanding. They dismissed the losing fighter's defensive strategy as cowardice, criticized his footwork, without comprehending its purpose, and completely misunderstood the tactical adjustments that had determined the outcome. Maria continued her cleaning routine while listening to their increasingly absurd commentary, biting her tongue as they demonstrated techniques that would have gotten them seriously hurt against competent opposition. Their confidence was matched only by their incompetence, a dangerous combination in a sport where overestimating your abilities could result in permanent damage. The breaking point came when Derek began critiquing the defensive tactics used by the losing fighter, demonstrating what he considered proper counter-punching technique by throwing slow-motion combinations at an imaginary opponent. His form was fundamentally flawed, his balance non-existent, and his understanding of distance and timing so poor that Maria had to suppress the urge to correct him. She had spent 3 decades perfecting the very techniques Derek was butchering, had earned millions of dollars executing the strategies he dismissed as cowardice. But explaining that would. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Require revealing more than she was prepared to share, so she continued mopping the floor while Derek and his disciples deconstructed a fight they were completely unqualified to analyze. The conversation continued for over an hour, growing more ridiculous with each passing minute as the fighters competed to demonstrate their expertise by offering increasingly absurd insights about what they would have done differently. They questioned the losing fighter's heart, his preparation, his ability to handle pressure, never considering that they were critiquing someone who had already accomplished more in the sport than they could ever dream of achieving. Maria finished her cleaning routine and prepared to leave before the serious training began, as she had every morning for the past 2 years. But Derek's voice stopped her at the door with a comment that revealed the depth of his ignorance and the casual cruelty that passed for humor among his followers. "You know what the problem is with boxing today," Derek announced to his audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been humbled by superior opposition. "Too many people think they understand the sport just because they've watched some fights on TV. Real boxing requires heart, requires the ability to take punishment and keep coming forward. Something most people, especially women, will never understand." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with assumptions about gender, toughness, and the nature of combat itself. Maria paused at the door, her hand on the handle, wrestling with the impulse to respond to ignorance that was so profound it bordered on comedy. But she had learned the value of silence during her years in exile from the sport, had discovered that some battles weren't worth fighting because the cost of victory exceeded any possible reward. She left the gym without responding, driving home to her modest apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better days, where she lived surrounded by memories she couldn't display and achievements she couldn't acknowledge. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph of her daughter's graduation from college, the only hint of the life she had built outside the ring. But Derek's words echoed in her mind throughout the day, representing everything she had come to despise about the sport she had once loved. The casual dismissal of women's capabilities, the assumption that toughness could only be measured by the willingness to absorb punishment, the complete ignorance of the technical aspects that separated true artists from mere brawlers. Maria had spent her career proving that boxing was about intelligence as much as courage, about the ability to think under pressure rather than simply endure it. She had revolutionized women's boxing by demonstrating that skill could triumph over size, that technique could overcome raw power, that preparation and dedication mattered more than any genetic advantages. Her insurance policy had been purchased by promoters who understood that her hands were worth more than most people's houses, that her ability to generate revenue through her devastating knockout power represented an investment that needed protection. The premium payments had been enormous, justified by earnings that reflected her status as the most feared puncher in women's boxing history. But that world felt like a lifetime ago, separated from her current existence by a wall of tragedy and guilt that she had built brick by brick during the years since her retirement. The woman who had once commanded million-dollar purses now earned minimum wage, cleaning up after fighters who wouldn't have been qualified to spar with her during her amateur days. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Maria as she sat in her apartment that evening, staring at the photograph of her daughter and remembering the dreams they had shared before everything went wrong. She had left boxing to protect the people she loved, had chosen anonymity over legacy to ensure that her daughter could live a normal life free from the violence that had defined Maria's career. But Derek's casual dismissal of women's capabilities in boxing had awakened something that she had worked hard to suppress, a competitive fire that had never been completely extinguished despite years of deliberate neglect. The part of her that had once been the most feared woman in professional boxing was stirring, responding to ignorance with the kind of anger that had fueled her legendary knockout power. The question now was whether she had the strength to keep that part of herself buried, or whether Derek's arrogance would force her to reveal capabilities that she had spent years hiding from the world. The quiet cleaning lady was about to face a choice between continued anonymity and the kind of confrontation that could change everything. Not just for herself, but for everyone at Iron Fist Boxing Academy who thought they understood what it meant to be a real fighter. As Maria prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about the insurance policy that had once protected her hands, the millions of dollars in coverage that reflected the destructive potential contained within her seemingly ordinary fingers. Those hands had ended careers, had generated fortunes, had commanded respect from the most dangerous women in the world. Tomorrow she would return to Iron Fist with the same mop and the same invisible presence, but something fundamental had changed. in the dynamic between herself and the fighters who dismissed her existence. Derek had planted seeds of confrontation that would grow in ways he couldn't anticipate, challenging assumptions about power, gender, and the true nature of combat that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about. The unassuming woman who cleaned their gym. The storm was coming to Iron Fist Boxing Academy, and Derek "Thunder" Thompson had no idea that he had just challenged someone whose lightning had once been insured for more money than he would earn in a lifetime. The quiet cleaning lady was about to remind everyone that the most dangerous opponents often come disguised as the least threatening, and that true power doesn't announce itself with boasts and bravado, but reveals itself through actions that speak louder than any words ever could. Maria's transformation from invisible service worker to legendary fighter was about to begin, but the cost of that revelation would be higher than anyone at Iron Fist could imagine. The insurance money that had once protected her hands would soon become relevant again, but not in the way anyone expected. The simple woman who cleaned their gym was about to show them what real boxing looked like, and the education was going to be more expensive than they were prepared to pay. The harassment began subtly, the way it always did with men like Derek Thompson. Small comments disguised as friendly observations about how women didn't belong in certain spaces. Casual jokes about Maria's age and appearance that his training partners laughed at with the uncomfortable enthusiasm of people afraid to challenge the gym's alpha male. Schedule changes that forced her to clean around active training sessions instead of before them, disrupting the quiet solitude she had maintained for 2 years. Maria recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it before in different contexts. With different stakes, the systematic application of social pressure designed to make someone uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily. Derek wasn't trying to get her fired, at least not directly. He was trying to make her quit, to convince her that Iron Fist wasn't the place where she belonged. The first major escalation came during a busy afternoon training session, when Derek decided to make Maria's presence part of his entertainment routine. She was mopping near the heavy bags when he called out to his sparring partner loud enough for the entire gym to hear, "Watch this, Marcus. I bet the cleaning lady thinks she knows something about boxing, just because she's been around the gym for a while." Derek's voice carried the kind of casual cruelty that people used when they wanted to establish dominance through humiliation. "Maybe she's been taking notes while she empties our trash cans." Marcus Williams, Derek's regular sparring partner and one of his most devoted followers, laughed with the nervous energy of someone who understood he was expected to participate in whatever performance Derek had planned. Marcus had decent amateur credentials, but lacked the natural athleticism that made Derek special, compensating for his limitations by attaching himself to someone whose success might reflect well on his own reputation. "Come on, Derek," Marcus replied, throwing a lazy jab at the heavy bag. "Leave the lady alone. She's just trying to do her job." But Derek was just getting started, feeding off the attention from the dozen other fighters who had stopped their training to watch whatever spectacle he was creating. The afternoon crowd at Iron Fist included several fighters preparing for upcoming amateur bouts, a few recreational boxers who came in after work to blow off steam, and the usual collection of wannabes who hung around hoping to absorb some of Derek's confidence through proximity. "I'm not bothering anybody," Derek announced, his voice growing louder with each word. "I'm just saying that some people think they understand boxing because they've seen it on TV or cleaned up after real fighters. But there's a difference between watching and doing, between being around the sport and actually living it." Maria continued mopping, moving methodically around the equipment while Derek's audience grew larger and more engaged. She had learned to recognize the signs of escalating confrontation, the way that one person's need for attention could quickly transform into mob mentality if given the right circumstances. But she also understood that responding would only provide Derek with the reaction he was seeking. "You know what I think?" Derek continued, warming to his theme as he noticed more people paying attention to his commentary. I think we should ask our cleaning expert what she thinks about that fight we were discussing this morning. Get her professional opinion on defensive strategy and counterpunching techniques. The suggestion was met with nervous laughter from his audience, the kind of uncomfortable amusement that people displayed when they weren't sure whether they were witnessing harmless teasing or something more malicious. Several of the older fighters exchanged glances that suggested they had seen this type of performance before and knew it rarely ended well for anyone involved. Tony Marcello emerged from his office at the sound of raised voices, his expression showing the weary irritation of someone who had spent decades managing the egos and conflicts that inevitably arose in competitive environments. Tony had built Iron Fist's reputation on the principle that serious training required serious attitudes, but he also understood that Derek's rising professional profile brought prestige and paying customers to the gym. What's going on out here? Tony asked, his voice carrying enough authority to quiet the room temporarily. Some of you have fights coming up. This isn't social hour. Derek turned toward the gym owner with the confident smile of someone who had never been held accountable for crossing lines that others respected. Just having a little fun, Tony. Nothing serious. We were discussing boxing technique and wondered if Maria here had any insights to share from all her years of observation. The challenge was carefully crafted to put Tony in an impossible position. Defending Maria would require acknowledging that Derek was being inappropriate, potentially creating conflict with his most successful fighter. But allowing the harassment to continue would establish a precedent that could drive away other employees and create the kind of hostile environment that invited lawsuits. Tony's response revealed his priorities with uncomfortable clarity. Derek, focus on your training. Maria, maybe work on the office area for a while. Let these guys concentrate on their preparation. The suggestion was presented as a reasonable compromise, but everyone in the room understood its real meaning. Tony was protecting Derek's right to train without distraction while placing the burden of conflict avoidance on Maria. The message was received and understood by everyone present. Derek's comfort and training environment took precedence over Maria's right to do her job without harassment. Maria nodded without argument and gathered her cleaning supplies, moving toward the office area as suggested. But Derek wasn't finished with his performance, sensing that he had established dominance without facing any meaningful consequences for his behavior. That's what I thought, Derek called out as Maria walked away. Some people know their place and some people need to be reminded. Real fighters earn respect through action, not by hanging around hoping some of it rubs off. The comment drew appreciative chuckles from Derek's core supporters and uncomfortable silence from the more experienced fighters who understood that respect was something that could be lost as easily as earned. But the damage was done. Derek had established himself as someone who could humiliate service workers without consequences while reinforcing the gym's hierarchy in front of an audience that would remember his dominance. Maria spent the remainder of the afternoon cleaning Tony's office while listening to the sounds of training that continued in the main gym. The rhythmic impact of gloves against heavy bags, the squeak of shoes on canvas during sparring sessions, the casual conversation between rounds that revealed the depth of most fighters' ignorance about the technical aspects of their chosen sport. The office itself was a shrine to Tony's modest boxing career and his more successful business ventures. Photographs lined the walls, showing him with various fighters who had trained at Iron Fist over the years, from promising amateurs who had never fulfilled their potential to the occasional professional who had achieved regional success before fading into obscurity. The desk was covered with paperwork related to upcoming amateur shows, insurance forms, and equipment catalogs that reflected the constant financial pressure of operating a gym that catered to people whose dreams exceeded their budgets. As Maria dusted the photographs and emptied wastebaskets filled with protein bar wrappers and crumpled training schedules, She found herself thinking about the insurance policy that had once protected her hands. The premiums had been enormous, justified by earnings that reflected her status as the most feared puncher in women's boxing history. But the coverage had been about more than just protecting her ability to earn money. It had been recognition of the weapon-like potential contained within her seemingly ordinary hands. The policy had covered everything from accidental injury to intentional damage, protecting both Maria and her opponents from the financial consequences of her devastating knockout power. The insurance company had required extensive medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and demonstrations of her capabilities before agreeing to provide coverage that reflected the genuine danger she represented to anyone foolish enough to face her in the ring. Maria's knockout record had been unprecedented in women's boxing, not just for the frequency of her finishes, but for the brutal efficiency with which she ended fights. Opponents who had never been dropped before found themselves unconscious from punches they never saw coming. Champions who had built their reputations on durability discovered that no amount of conditioning could prepare them for the force Maria generated through perfect technique and timing. The secret to her power hadn't been size or strength, but the ability to transfer every ounce of energy from her legs through her core to her fists at the precise moment of impact. She had spent decades perfecting the biomechanics of power generation, studying the physics of force transfer with the dedication of a scientist and the passion of an artist. Her punches arrived with the accumulated force of her entire body, delivered with surgical precision to targets that maximized both damage and dramatic effect. But that world felt impossibly distant from her current circumstances, separated by years of deliberately cultivated anonymity and the tragedy that had driven her from professional boxing. The woman who had once commanded million-dollar purses and headlined pay-per-view events now earned minimum wage, cleaning up after fighters who wouldn't have been qualified to serve as her sparring partners during her amateur days. The irony of Derek's harassment wasn't lost on Maria as she continued her cleaning routine. He was trying to establish dominance over someone whose understanding of combat exceeded his own by orders of magnitude, questioning the boxing knowledge of someone who had forgotten more about the sport than he would ever learn. His casual dismissal of women's capabilities revealed an ignorance so profound that it bordered on comedy. But the harassment continued throughout the week, escalating in ways that tested Maria's commitment to maintaining her anonymity. Derek began timing his most impressive training sessions to coincide with her cleaning schedule, ensuring that she was present to witness displays of power and skill that were designed to reinforce her inferior status in the gym's hierarchy. He would throw particularly vicious combinations at the heavy bags while she mopped nearby, accompanying each punch with commentary about what separated real fighters from pretenders. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective, designed to make Maria feel unwelcome without crossing lines that might provoke intervention from Tony or other gym authorities. Derek understood the dynamics of workplace harassment well enough to avoid behavior that could be documented or reported, instead relying on innuendo, implication, and the kind of casual cruelty that could be dismissed as harmless teasing if challenged. Maria's colleagues among the gym's cleaning and maintenance staff watched the harassment with growing discomfort, but felt powerless to intervene. They understood that Derek's rising professional profile made him untouchable within Iron Fist's hierarchy, and that challenging his behavior could result in their own employment being terminated. Their sympathy for Maria was genuine, but came with practical limitations that reflected the reality of their economic circumstances. The breaking point came during a packed afternoon training session when Derek decided to escalate his harassment in front of the largest possible audience. The gym was filled with fighters preparing for an upcoming amateur show that Tony was promoting, creating an atmosphere of intense focus and competitive energy that Derek wanted to exploit for maximum dramatic effect. Maria was cleaning around the ring where Derek and Marcus were conducting a technical sparring session, working on specific combinations and defensive strategies under Tony's supervision. The session was being watched by most of the gym's regular fighters, who understood they were witnessing the kind of high-level training that separated professionals from amateurs. Derek's performance in the ring was genuinely impressive, his combinations flowing with the kind of fluid precision that suggested years of dedicated training. His footwork was crisp, his defense sound, and his power evident even through the protective gear that prevented serious injury during sparring. Marcus was clearly outclassed, but gamely tried to provide useful resistance while avoiding the kind of punishment that could disrupt his own training schedule. Between rounds, Derek noticed Maria mopping near the ring and decided to incorporate her presence into his training narrative. "You know what the problem is with boxing today?" he announced to his audience, loud enough to ensure that Maria could hear every word. "Too many people think they understand the sport without ever stepping into the ring themselves. They watch fights on TV, and suddenly they're experts on technique and strategy." The comment was clearly directed at Maria, though Derek maintained plausible deniability by addressing the crowd rather than confronting her directly. Several fighters shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty of using someone's employment, vulnerability as entertainment for their own amusement. "Real boxing," Derek continued, throwing shadow punches between sentences, "requires the willingness to get hit while you're learning to hit back. It requires facing someone who wants to hurt you and finding a way to hurt them first. It's not something you can understand from the outside looking in." Marcus nodded enthusiastically from his corner, eager to demonstrate his agreement with Derek's philosophy, even though his own limited ring experience contradicted most of what was being said. The other fighters listened with varying degrees of interest and discomfort, some buying into Derek's rhetoric while others recognized it as the kind of pseudo-intellectual posturing that insecure fighters used to mask their own limitations. Tony called for the next round to begin, hoping to redirect the session's focus back to actual training rather than whatever point Derek was trying to make. But Derek had tasted blood and wasn't ready to abandon his performance, especially with such an attentive audience available to witness his dominance. As the sparring resumed, Derek began talking to Maria directly while throwing punches at Marcus, creating a bizarre conversation that mixed technical boxing instruction with personal humiliation. "See this left hook, Maria? This is what happens when you commit your whole body to the punch. Something you can't learn from watching other people train." The psychological abuse was masterful in its subtlety, disguised as educational commentary, while systematically undermining Maria's presence in a space where she was already vulnerable. Derek was demonstrating that he could hurt people with words as effectively as with his fists, establishing dominance through verbal violence that was harder to document than physical assault. Maria continued cleaning while Derek's commentary grew more pointed and personal, his attacks becoming less subtle as he gained confidence from the lack of intervention by gym authorities. The afternoon session stretched on interminably, with Derek using each round break as an opportunity to deliver additional insults disguised as boxing wisdom. The culmination came when Derek, flush with adrenaline from a particularly impressive combination that had staggered Marcus, turned directly toward Maria and issued a challenge that crossed every line of professional propriety. "Maybe you should try hitting something instead of just cleaning around it, Maria. Might teach you something about what real boxing feels like." The suggestion was accompanied by derisive laughter from Derek's supporters and uncomfortable silence from the more experienced fighters who understood they were witnessing something that went beyond acceptable behavior. The challenge hung in the air like a dare, loaded with implications about gender, capability, and the fundamental nature of combat itself. Maria looked up from her mopping for the first time since Derek's harassment had begun, meeting his gaze directly with an expression that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. There was something in her eyes that didn't match the submissive cleaning lady Derek had been systematically humiliating, a stillness that suggested depths he hadn't anticipated. "I appreciate the suggestion," Maria replied quietly, her voice carrying a quality that made the room grow quiet despite the ongoing training session. "But I'm here to work, not to play games." Derek's eyes narrowed at what he clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance from someone he had been successfully intimidating for weeks. The quiet resistance challenged his dominance in front of an audience that had been enjoying his performance, threatening to undermine the authority he had. "Work to establish games?" Derek repeated, his voice rising with indignation. "Lady, this isn't a game. This is serious training for serious fighters. Maybe you should stick to cleaning and leave the boxing to people who actually understand it." The dismissal was intended to end the conversation while reasserting Derek's superiority, but something in Maria's bearing suggested that the dynamic had shifted in ways he didn't understand. The quiet cleaning lady was revealing glimpses of someone who possessed confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "I understand more than you think," Maria said, her voice carrying absolute certainty that made the room grow even quieter. "The question is whether you understand the difference between showing off and actually knowing what you're doing." The response was so unexpected that Derek stood motionless in the ring for several seconds, processing the fact that someone he had been systematically humiliating had just questioned his competence in front of everyone who mattered at Iron Fist. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested Maria possessed knowledge Derek couldn't access. Tony stepped between the ring and Maria's position, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to manage through casual intervention. "All right, that's enough entertainment for one day. Derek, finish your session. Maria, maybe take a break until the training winds down." But Derek wasn't ready to let the moment pass without reasserting his dominance, especially after being challenged by someone he considered beneath his attention. "No, Tony. I think Maria here has something she wants to prove. Maybe we should give her the chance." The suggestion carried the kind of dangerous energy that preceded serious conflicts, loaded with masculine pride and competitive instincts that could quickly spiral beyond anyone's control. Derek was proposing something that everyone in the room understood would end badly for Maria, but his ego demanded a confrontation that would definitively establish his superiority. Maria looked around the room at faces that reflected curiosity, concern, and anticipation of whatever violence Derek was suggesting. She understood that she had reached a decision point that would determine not just her immediate future, but her ability to continue serving in the only capacity that gave her life meaning. The choice was whether to maintain her anonymity and accept whatever humiliation Derek decided to inflict, or to reveal capabilities that she had spent years hiding from a world that had already cost her everything she cared about. The quiet cleaning lady was about to discover whether the price of dignity was worth paying when the currency was measured in secrets that could never be taken back once revealed. Derek sensed her hesitation and pressed his advantage, knowing that backing down now would undermine everything he had worked to establish. "Come on, Maria. You seem to think you understand boxing better than the rest of us. Here's your chance to prove it instead of just talking about it." The challenge hung in the air like a loaded weapon, waiting for someone to pull the trigger that would transform a workplace conflict into something far more dangerous and irreversible. Maria felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the expectations and assumptions that had kept her invisible for 2 years, suddenly focused on a decision that would change everything. The storm was about to break at Iron Fist Boxing Academy, and Derek Thompson had no idea that he had just challenged someone whose insurance policy had once reflected the most dangerous hands in women's boxing history. The quiet cleaning lady was about to face a choice between continued anonymity and the kind of revelation that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about power, gender, and the true nature of combat. The silence in Iron Fist Boxing Academy stretched like a taut wire vibrating with tension that seemed to affect everyone in the building. Maria Santos stood motionless near her mop bucket, weighing a decision that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her carefully constructed life. Around her, 23 fighters, trainers, and gym regulars waited for her response to Derek's challenge, their faces reflecting everything from curiosity to concern to barely contained anticipation of violence. Derek Thompson bounced lightly, on his toes in the center of the ring, his gloves still on from the sparring session with Marcus, sweat glistening on his shoulders as he radiated the kind of predatory confidence that came from never having been seriously tested. His professional record of 15 wins and 0 losses had been built against carefully selected opposition, fighters who possessed enough credibility to enhance his reputation, but lacked the skills to seriously threaten his undefeated status. Tony Marcello positioned himself between the ring and Maria, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to manage a situation that had escalated beyond his comfort zone. Tony had seen enough gym conflicts over the decades to recognize when masculine pride and competitive instincts created dynamics that could spiral into serious legal and financial problems for everyone involved. But Derek's rising profile as a professional fighter made him too valuable to alienate, while Maria represented exactly the kind of expendable employee who could be replaced without disrupting the gym's core business. "Derek, let's call it a day," Tony suggested, his voice carrying forced casualness that fooled nobody in the room. "You've got that fight coming up next month. No point risking an injury over something this silly." But Derek had tasted blood and sensed weakness, recognizing that backing down now would undermine the dominance he had worked to establish over the past several weeks. His systematic harassment of Maria had been about more than simple cruelty. It had been a demonstration of his power within the gym's hierarchy, proof that he could humiliate anyone without facing meaningful consequences. "There's no risk here, Tony," Derek replied, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the building. "Maria seems to think she understands boxing better than people who actually fight for a living. I'm just offering her the chance to put her knowledge to the test instead of hiding behind that mop." Marcus Williams climbed out of the ring and joined the growing crowd of spectators, his face flushed from the sparring session, but his eyes bright with the excitement of someone who sensed he was about to witness something memorable. Marcus had been Derek's primary training partner for over a year, absorbing punishment during countless sessions, while Derek honed the skills that were carrying him toward a potential title shot. "Come on, Derek," Marcus said, but his tone suggested he was going through the motions of being reasonable rather than genuinely trying to defuse the situation. "She's just trying to earn a living. Leave her alone." The half-hearted intervention only seemed to fuel Derek's confidence, confirming his belief that nobody in the room was willing to genuinely challenge his authority. He had successfully established himself as the alpha male of Iron Fist through a combination of legitimate boxing skill and carefully orchestrated psychological dominance over anyone who might threaten his position. "I'm not bothering anybody," Derek announced, addressing the room rather than any individual. "I'm offering free boxing lessons to someone who clearly thinks she needs them. Maria here seems to believe she knows something about technique and strategy. Well, here's your chance to demonstrate that knowledge in practical application." The challenge was crafted with the kind of malicious precision that Derek had perfected during his amateur career, when he had learned to use psychological warfare as effectively as physical violence to defeat opponents before they ever entered the ring. He understood that humiliating Maria would serve multiple purposes, reinforcing his dominance, entertaining his followers, and establishing clear boundaries about who belonged in the serious business of combat sports. Maria looked around the room at faces that reflected the complex dynamics of a community built around violence and competition. Some of the fighters appeared genuinely uncomfortable with Derek's behavior, recognizing that he was crossing lines that separated aggressive training from outright bullying. Others seemed excited by the prospect of witnessing whatever punishment Derek was planning to inflict on someone foolish enough to challenge his expertise. The older fighters, those who had been around boxing long enough to understand its history and traditions, watched with expressions that suggested they had seen similar scenarios play out before. They understood that Derek was operating from a position of ignorance about the sport's broader context, dismissing entire categories of fighters based on assumptions that revealed more about his prejudices than his knowledge. But Maria also recognized something else in the faces around her, the assumption that she would back down, that the challenge would end with her apologizing for whatever offense Derek imagined she had committed and returning to her cleaning duties with appropriate humility. Everyone in the room, including Tony, expected the confrontation to conclude with Derek's dominance reaffirmed and Maria's status as an inferior presence confirmed. The weight of their expectations pressed down on Maria like a physical force, reminding her of all the reasons she had chosen anonymity over recognition, service over glory, peace over the violence that had defined her professional career. She had spent 2 years building a life where nobody questioned her presence or demanded explanations about her past, where she could contribute to the sport she loved without carrying the burden of being a legend. But Derek's systematic harassment had made that existence impossible to maintain. His casual dismissal of women's capabilities in boxing, his assumption that she was somehow inferior because of her gender and employment status, and his willingness to humiliate her for the entertainment of his followers had awakened something that she had worked hard to suppress. Maria Santos, the invisible cleaning lady, was about to disappear forever. In her place would emerge someone whose insurance policy had once reflected the most dangerous hands in women's boxing history, someone whose knockout power had redefined what was possible for female fighters, someone whose technical mastery had elevated an entire division of professional boxing. "All right," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room with startling clarity. "If you insist on making this about boxing knowledge, I suppose we should settle it properly." The response sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd, who had expected either submission or retreat from someone in Maria's vulnerable position. Derek's confident smile faltered slightly as he processed the fact that his target had accepted a challenge that everyone understood would end badly for her. "Maria, don't," called out Jenny Rodriguez, one of the few women who trained regularly at Iron Fist. Jenny was a competitive amateur who had always treated Maria with the respect Derek withheld, understanding that gender solidarity required standing up for each other in environments that were often hostile to female participation. "He's trying to make you look foolish. Don't give him the satisfaction." But Maria was already moving toward the equipment area where the gloves were stored, her steps measured and deliberate in a way that suggested she had made a decision that went beyond the immediate confrontation. Several fighters moved aside to give her space, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty as they realized she was serious about accepting Derek's challenge. Tony stepped forward, recognizing that he needed to assert some control over a situation that was threatening to spiral beyond his ability to manage. "Hold on, Maria. This isn't necessary. Derek's just blowing off steam after a hard training session. Nobody needs to prove anything here." The intervention was motivated more by liability concerns than genuine care for Maria's well-being, but it represented the kind of face-saving exit that everyone expected her to accept gratefully. Tony was offering her the chance to retreat with some dignity intact while giving Derek credit for being magnanimous in victory. "Actually, Tony," Maria replied, selecting a pair of gloves from the equipment rack with movements that seemed strangely familiar to several of the more observant fighters, "I think something does need to be proven here. Derek has been questioning my understanding of boxing for weeks. Maybe it's time to demonstrate exactly how much I know about the sport." The statement was delivered with a quiet confidence that didn't match anything Derek or his followers had observed during Maria's 2 years at Iron Fist. there was something in her bearing, in the way she handled the boxing gloves, that suggested familiarity with equipment that went beyond casual observation. Derek's initial surprise gave way to renewed confidence as he fully processed what was happening. Maria, a 52-year-old cleaning lady with no apparent athletic background, was actually going to step into the ring with a professional fighter who possessed genuine knockout power and 15 wins, against increasingly competitive opposition. The scenario was so absurd that Derek began to wonder if she was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown brought on by weeks of systematic harassment. "Maria, are you sure about this?" Derek asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern that was probably the first authentic emotion he had displayed during the entire confrontation. "I mean, I appreciate the gesture, but this isn't going to be like sparring with your girlfriends. At some cardio boxing class, I hit pretty hard." The condescending tone revealed Derek's complete inability to conceive of Maria as anything other than a delusional amateur who had been watching too much boxing on television. His understanding of the sport's history was so limited that he genuinely believed no woman could possess the kind of technical knowledge or physical capability necessary to challenge a male professional fighter. Maria began wrapping her hands with movements that were automatic and precise, the muscle memory of thousands of training sessions guiding her fingers through a ritual that had once been as familiar as breathing. Several of the older fighters watched her hand-wrapping technique with growing interest, noting details that separated experienced fighters from casual enthusiasts. "I appreciate your concern, Derek," Maria replied, her voice maintaining the same quiet tone that had characterized her response throughout the escalating confrontation. "But I think I can handle whatever you're planning to dish out. The question is whether you can handle what comes back." The response drew nervous laughter from several spectators who assumed Maria was engaging in the kind of trash talk that preceded amateur sparring sessions, not understanding that her words carried implications about capability and experience that went far beyond anything they could imagine. Marcus helped Derek adjust his gloves and offered tactical advice that revealed his own limited understanding of the situation they were witnessing. "Just take it easy on her, Derek. Tap her a few times to make your point, then let her save face by saying she's learned something. No need to actually hurt the woman." But Derek was already caught up in the performance aspect of the confrontation, feeding off the attention from an audience that expected him to deliver a demonstration of male superiority disguised as boxing instruction. He had built his reputation on the ability to overwhelm opponents with combinations that showcased both technical skill and devastating power, and he saw no reason to modify his approach for someone who had foolishly agreed to be educated about the realities of combat sports. Tony made one final attempt to prevent what he increasingly recognized as a potential disaster for everyone involved. "Look, this has gone far enough. Maria, go home for the day. Derek, you've made your point. Let's just call this whole thing even and move on." But Maria was already climbing through the ropes into the ring, her movements displaying a familiarity with the environment that surprised several onlookers who had never seen her anywhere near the training area. She moved with the kind of casual confidence that came from spending years in similar spaces, understanding the geography of combat in ways that couldn't be learned through observation alone. Derek followed her into the ring, bouncing on his toes with the nervous energy of someone who was excited about the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority in front of an appreciative audience. He began throwing shadow punches to warm up, his combinations flowing with the kind of practiced precision that had carried him through an undefeated professional career. The crowd pressed closer to the ring, sensing that they were about to witness something memorable even if they couldn't quite predict what form it would take. Cell phones appeared as several fighters began recording what they assumed would be a brief and humiliating lesson in the differences between watching boxing and actually participating in it. Maria positioned herself in the center of the ring, and began moving in ways that immediately caught the attention of anyone who understood advanced boxing technique. Her footwork was subtle but precise, maintaining balance while creating angles that maximize her options for both offense and defense. Her guard was economical, protecting vital targets without telegraphing her intentions or limiting her mobility. "Holy shit," whispered Jimmy Martinez, a former amateur champion who trained at Iron Fist 3 times a week and had developed a reputation for recognizing technical excellence regardless of its source. "Look at how she's moving. That's not beginner stuff." Several other experienced fighters began paying closer attention to Maria's preparation, noting details that separated trained fighters from enthusiastic amateurs. Her breathing was controlled and rhythmic, her posture balanced and relaxed, her visual focus directed toward Derek's center mass rather than his gloves or face. Everything about her preparation suggested familiarity with high-level competition. That went far beyond anything her employment history would indicate. Derek began his approach with the kind of casual aggression that he used against overmatched sparring partners, throwing lazy jabs designed more to establish distance and dominance than to inflict damage. His plan was to gradually increase the pace and power of his attacks until Maria realized she was completely outclassed and asked to stop the session. But his first jab, thrown with about 30% of his maximum power, never reached its intended target. Maria slipped the punch with minimal movement, her head sliding just far enough offline to let Derek's glove whistle past her ear without making contact. The defensive technique was so smooth and economical that several onlookers initially missed what had happened. Derek's second jab met the same fate, evaded with the kind of precise timing that suggested Maria could see his punches coming long before they arrived. His third attempt, thrown with increased speed and conviction, was parried with a defensive movement that redirected his glove harmlessly past her shoulder while simultaneously creating an opening for a counterpunch that Maria chose not to exploit. The crowd's energy shifted from anticipation of violence to genuine fascination with what they were witnessing. Maria wasn't just surviving Derek's initial assault. She was making him look clumsy and predictable in ways that challenged everything they thought they understood about the relative capabilities of the two fighters. "What the hell?" Derek muttered, stepping back to reassess a situation that wasn't developing according to his expectations. He had expected to land his first few punches easily, establishing immediate dominance that would quickly demoralize his opponent and end the session before anyone could be seriously hurt. Instead, he found himself facing someone who seemed to anticipate his attacks before he threw them, who moved with the kind of relaxed efficiency that suggested vast experience with exactly this type of confrontation. Maria's defensive technique was so advanced that Derek began to wonder if she had somehow studied video of his previous fights and developed specific strategies to counter his preferred combinations. Tony climbed onto the ring apron, sensing that the dynamics of the confrontation had shifted in ways that threatened to expose his star fighter to the kind of humiliation that could damage his professional reputation. "All right, that's enough. Maria, you've proven whatever point you wanted to make. Derek, save your energy for fighters who actually matter." But Derek's pride had been stung by his inability to land clean punches against someone he had been systematically humiliating for weeks. The failure challenged his understanding of his own capabilities and threatened to undermine his status within the gym's hierarchy if he couldn't quickly re-establish dominance through superior firepower. "No way, Tony," Derek replied, his voice carrying an edge of frustration that revealed how the session was affecting his confidence. "This lady thinks she knows something about boxing. I'm going to show her what real professional power feels like." Derek stepped forward with renewed aggression, throwing combinations with increased speed and power as he attempted to overwhelm Maria's defensive capabilities through sheer volume and force. His left hook carried genuine knockout power, the kind of punch that had ended several of his professional fights early and established his reputation as a dangerous finisher. but the hook never reached its target. Maria ducked under the incoming punch with perfect timing, her movement so smooth and economical that she seemed to disappear from Derek's line of sight for a split second before reappearing in position to launch a devastating counterattack. Her response came in the form of a right hand that traveled less than 8 inches but contained the accumulated force of her entire body, delivered with the kind of technical precision that had once made her the most feared puncher in women's boxing history. The punch landed flush on Derek's solar plexus with surgical accuracy, targeting the nerve cluster that controlled his diaphragm with the expertise of someone who understood human anatomy at the level of a medical professional. Derek's body folded around Maria's fist like he had been hit with a sledgehammer, his legs immediately losing their ability to support his weight as every molecule of air was driven from his lungs with brutal efficiency. He dropped to his knees. In the center of the ring, his mouth opening and closing silently as he struggled to breathe through a diaphragm that had been temporarily paralyzed by the impact. The gym fell absolutely silent except for the sound of Derek's desperate attempts to draw breath, his face rapidly changing color as his oxygen-starved system fought to recover from trauma that his brain couldn't quite process. He had been hit hard before during his professional career, had absorbed punishment from opponents who possessed legitimate knockout power, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the clinical precision of Maria's counterattack. Maria stood over Derek's fallen form with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout their entire confrontation, her breathing unchanged by the brief exchange of violence. There was no celebration in her demeanor, no satisfaction at having proven her point, just the quiet professionalism of someone who had done exactly what was necessary to end a conflict that had been forced upon her. "Jesus Christ," whispered Marcus, his voice barely audible in the stunned silence that had enveloped the gym. "What just happened?" Jimmy Martinez stepped closer to the ring, his experienced eye analyzing what he had just witnessed with the expertise of someone who had seen thousands of punches thrown in anger. "That was a body shot," he said, his voice carrying a note of professional admiration that bordered on reverence. "Perfect placement, perfect timing, perfect power transfer. I've never seen anything like it." Several fighters began pulling out their phones to call for medical assistance, but Derek was already beginning to recover as his diaphragm slowly regained its ability to function. His breathing came in ragged gasps that gradually steadied as oxygen returned to his system, but his eyes reflected the shock of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered. Tony vaulted into the ring, positioning himself between Maria and Derek while trying to process what he had just witnessed. His star professional fighter, the man who had been building toward a potential title shot, had been dropped with a single punch by a 52-year-old cleaning lady who had never shown the slightest interest in boxing beyond her employment duties. "Derek, are you all right?" Tony asked, kneeling beside his fighter while keeping one eye on Maria, who stood calmly in the opposite corner as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Do you need me to call for an ambulance?" Derek managed to wave off the medical assistants while struggling to his feet, his legs still unsteady from the impact that had temporarily disconnected his brain from his motor functions. The punch had been delivered with such precision that it had caused maximum disruption to his system without inflicting permanent damage, the work of someone who understood exactly how to disable an opponent without crossing the line into life-threatening injury. "I'm fine," Derek managed to gasp, though his voice lacked the confident authority that had characterized his speech throughout the escalating confrontation. "Just caught me off guard. That was lucky." But everyone in the room who understood boxing recognized that luck had played no role in what they had witnessed. Maria's counterattack had been the product of technical mastery that couldn't be acquired through casual observation or weekend classes at a local community center. The precision of her timing, the economy of her movement, and the devastating Effectiveness of her punch selection revealed expertise that operated at levels that none of them had suspected. Maria began removing her gloves with the same methodical precision she brought to her cleaning duties, her movements suggesting that the brief exchange of violence had been nothing more than a minor interruption in her daily routine. She showed no signs of adrenaline or excitement, no indication that dropping a professional fighter with a single punch represented anything more than a necessary response to an unfortunate situation. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Jenny Rodriguez, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief that reflected the questions racing through every mind in the building. "That wasn't self-defense class stuff. That was professional-level technique." Maria paused in her glove removal, meeting Jenny's gaze with an expression that suggested she was weighing how much truth the situation required. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 2 years had been shattered by 30 seconds of violence, forcing her to decide whether to retreat back into obscurity or acknowledge the capabilities that had been revealed through Derek's ignorance and arrogance. "I had some training when I was younger," Maria replied, her tone carrying the same measured quality that had characterized her responses throughout the confrontation. "Nothing special. Just enough to take care of myself if the situation required it." The explanation satisfied nobody who had witnessed the clinical precision of her counterattack, but it represented the kind of modest deflection that people sometimes used when they possessed capabilities they preferred not to discuss. Several fighters exchanged glances that suggested they suspected there was significantly more to Maria's background than she was willing to reveal. Derek had recovered enough to stand without assistance, though his breathing remained labored and his complexion hadn't entirely returned to normal. The humiliation of being dropped by someone he had been systematically harassing was compounded by the presence of witnesses who would ensure that the story spread throughout the local boxing community within hours. "That was a sucker punch," Derek announced, his voice carrying defensive anger that revealed how deeply the experience had shaken his confidence. "I wasn't ready for her to actually throw anything serious. If I had known she was going to try to hurt me, things would have been different." The protest was met with uncomfortable silence from an audience that had clearly seen Derek initiate the aggression and escalate the confrontation at every opportunity. His attempt to reframe the encounter as somehow unfair or unexpected fell flat with people who had witnessed the entire sequence of events leading to his dramatic defeat. Marcus stepped forward to support his training partner, but his words lacked conviction as he struggled to reconcile what he had observed with Derek's version of events. "Yeah, that was kind of a cheap shot. Derek was just trying to give you some light sparring practice. You didn't need to go all out like that." But Jimmy Martinez had seen enough high-level boxing to recognize excellence regardless of its source, and he wasn't willing to let Derek's humiliation be minimized through false narratives about what had actually occurred. "That wasn't a cheap shot," Jimmy said firmly. "That was textbook counterpunching." Derek threw first, threw hard, and got caught by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The assessment was supported by murmurs of agreement from several other experienced fighters who had observed the exchange closely enough to understand the technical aspects of what had occurred. Derek's attempt to characterize Maria's response as somehow unfair or unexpected was contradicted by the evidence that everyone had witnessed. Tony found himself in an impossible position, trying to protect the reputation of his star professional fighter while acknowledging the reality of what had just occurred in front of 24 witnesses. Derek's defeat would be discussed throughout the local boxing community, potentially damaging his prospects for future high-profile fights if the story spread to promoters and managers who valued invincibility over technical skill. "Look, everyone just calm down," Tony said, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to manage a crisis that threatened to damage his business reputation. "This was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Derek's preparing for a big fight next month. Nobody needs to make a bigger deal out of this than it already is. But the damage had already been done to Derek's aura of invincibility, the carefully cultivated image of dominance that had been central to his professional brand. Being dropped by a middle-aged cleaning lady in front of his training partners and admirers had shattered the psychological foundation of his confidence in ways that would be difficult to repair. Maria finished removing her gloves and hand wraps, folding them neatly before returning them to the equipment area where she had found them. Her movements remained calm and purposeful, showing no signs of the adrenaline rush that typically followed violent confrontations. She appeared ready to resume her cleaning duties as if nothing significant had occurred. "Maria," called out Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a sports medicine physician who trained at Iron Fist several times a week and had observed the entire confrontation with professional interest. "I'd like to talk to you when you have a moment." That was remarkable technique for someone with informal training. The request suggested that at least one person in the room suspected there was significantly more to Maria's background than her modest explanation had revealed. Dr. Hernandez had worked with professional fighters throughout her career and possessed the expertise necessary to recognize advanced technical skill regardless of its source. But Maria was already gathering her cleaning supplies, preparing to leave the gym before the situation could escalate further or attract additional attention that might force her to reveal more about her past than she was prepared to share. The brief confrontation with Derek had already shattered the anonymity she had worked to maintain, exposing capabilities that would inevitably lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer. "I appreciate the interest, Doctor," Maria replied, "but I really need to finish my work and get home. Long day tomorrow." The deflection was polite but firm, establishing boundaries that discouraged further inquiry while maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized her employment at Iron Fist. But several people in the room had already begun making connections between her demonstrated capabilities and rumors about legendary female fighters who had disappeared from professional boxing under mysterious circumstances. Derek remained in the ring, surrounded by supporters who were struggling to process what they had witnessed and find ways to minimize the damage to his reputation. The defeat had occurred so quickly and decisively that many of them were still trying to understand exactly what had happened and how their champion had been brought down by someone they had all dismissed as irrelevant. "She got lucky," Derek repeated, his voice gaining strength as he convinced himself that the outcome had been aberrational rather than revealing. "Caught me when I wasn't expecting anything serious. In a real fight, with proper preparation, things would be completely different." But the professional fighters in the room understood that luck played minimal role in the kind of precise counter-punching they had observed. Maria's technique had been too economical, too perfectly timed, too devastatingly effective to be attributed to chance or beginner's fortune. As Maria prepared to leave Iron Fist Boxing Academy, she carried with her the knowledge that her carefully constructed life of anonymity had been irreparably damaged by 30 seconds of violence that had revealed capabilities she had spent 2 years hiding. The insurance money that had once protected her hands would soon become relevant again, but not in the way she had anticipated when she first sought refuge in the cleaning profession. Derek's systematic harassment had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own limitations while revealing the presence of someone whose expertise operated at levels that none of them had suspected. The champion who had never been tested had finally met his match in the most unlikely possible form, and the education had been administered with surgical precision that left no doubt about the vast differences in their actual capabilities. The story would spread throughout the boxing community within hours, carrying with it questions about Maria's true identity and background that would force her to make decisions about whether to continue hiding her legendary past or embrace the recognition that her demonstrated skills had made inevitable. The quiet cleaning lady was about to discover that some secrets were too powerful to remain buried once they had been revealed through violence. Iron Fist Boxing Academy would never be the same after witnessing the destruction of their champions. Invincibility by someone they had all underestimated, and Derek Thompson would spend the rest of his career knowing that his perfect record had been shattered by a woman whose insurance policy had once reflected the most dangerous hands in the history of women's boxing. The ghost had emerged from her self-imposed exile, and the reverberations of her return would reshape everything about how the gym's community understood power, respect, and the difference between appearance and reality in the unforgiving world of professional combat sports. The aftermath of Derek Thompson's defeat rippled through the boxing community like seismic waves, carrying with it implications that extended far beyond the walls of Iron Fist Boxing Academy. Within hours of Maria's devastating counterattack, cell phone videos of the confrontation had spread across social media platforms, accompanied by increasingly wild speculation about the identity of the mysterious cleaning lady who had dropped a professional fighter with surgical precision. The initial reaction from Derek's management team was damage control of the most desperate variety. His promoter, Rick Castellanos, arrived at Iron Fist that same evening with a legal team and a public relations specialist, attempting to craft a narrative that would minimize the impact on Derek's upcoming fight and his long-term career prospects. The video evidence made outright denial impossible, but Castellanos hoped to frame the incident as a training accident rather than a legitimate defeat. Derek was helping out with some self-defense instruction for the gym staff, Castellanos explained to the local sports reporters who had gathered outside Iron Fist, drawn by rumors of an unprecedented upset. He got caught by an unexpected counterpunch during what was essentially a demonstration. Anyone who understands boxing knows that sparring accidents happen all the time. But the explanation satisfied nobody who had actually witnessed the confrontation or viewed the increasingly viral footage. Maria's technique had been too precise, too economical, too devastatingly effective to be dismissed as a lucky accident during a casual training session. The counterpunch had been delivered with the kind of clinical precision that spoke to years of professional experience at the highest levels of the sport. Dr. Patricia Hernandez spent the evening researching historical records of women's professional boxing, comparing the technique she had observed with archived footage of legendary female fighters from previous decades. Her medical background had trained her to observe biomechanics with scientific precision, and something about Maria's movement patterns had triggered memories of fights she had watched during her residency training. The breakthrough came when she discovered archived footage of Lightning Lopez, a legendary Mexican-American female boxer whose career had ended abruptly 15 years earlier under circumstances that remained mysterious within boxing circles. The similarities between Maria's counter-punching technique and Lopez's signature combinations were impossible to ignore, suggesting connections that went far beyond coincidental technical similarities. Lightning Lopez had been the most feared woman in professional boxing during her era, possessing knockout power that had redefined expectations about female fighting capabilities. Her insurance policy had been legendary within the industry, reflecting the genuine danger she represented to any opponent foolish enough to face her in the ring. But her career had ended suddenly following a tragic accident that had claimed the life of her daughter during a training camp preparation. The parallels between Lopez's documented technique and Maria's demonstrated capabilities were so striking that Dr. Hernandez began making discreet inquiries among her contacts in the boxing medical community. The responses she received were cryptic, but suggestive, hinting at rumors about Lopez's disappearance from professional boxing and speculation about her current whereabouts. Meanwhile, Derek struggled with the psychological aftermath of his defeat in ways that threatened to derail his preparation for the upcoming fight that was supposed to establish him as a legitimate title contender. The humiliation of being dropped by someone he had been systematically harassing was compounded by the viral nature of the footage, which had been viewed millions of times and generated thousands of comments questioning his legitimacy as a professional fighter. His training sessions became exercises in frustration as he found himself flinching from punches that reminded him of Maria's devastating counterattack. The confident aggression that had characterized his previous performances was replaced by hesitant caution that undermined the very foundations of his fighting style. His sparring partners began landing punches that would have been impossible to connect with during his previous preparations. Marcus Williams attempted to provide support and encouragement, but his own confidence had been shaken by witnessing the systematic destruction of someone he had considered invincible. "It was just a fluke, Derek," Marcus insisted during a particularly frustrating training session. "She caught you when you weren't expecting anything serious. In a real fight, with proper preparation and focus, you'd destroy her." But Derek's responses revealed the depth of his psychological trauma from the encounter. "Did you see how she moved, Marcus? That wasn't beginner's luck. That was professional-level technique from someone who's been doing this for years. We've been training alongside a legitimate killer and never even knew it." The admission represented a fundamental shift in Derek's understanding of his own capabilities and the nature of the sport he had devoted his life to mastering. His perfect professional record had been built against carefully selected opposition, fighters who possessed enough credibility to enhance his reputation, but lacked the skills to seriously test his limitations. Tony Marcello found himself dealing with a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build at Iron Fist Boxing Academy. Derek's defeat had undermined the gym's reputation for producing serious professional fighters, while Maria's revelation had exposed the fundamental ignorance that characterized much of the facility's training philosophy. Several fighters had already canceled their memberships, unwilling to continue training at a facility where their supposed expertise had been so thoroughly discredited. The financial implications were staggering. Derek's upcoming fight represented a significant payday for everyone involved, but his psychological state made victory increasingly unlikely against opposition that would be motivated by the knowledge that he had been dropped by a middle-aged cleaning lady. The sponsors who had supported Iron Fist based on Derek's rising profile were reconsidering their investments in light of the viral footage that had made him a laughingstock within boxing circles. Tony's attempts to convince Maria to return to work were met with polite but firm refusal. She had already found employment with a private cleaning service that offered higher wages and more flexible scheduling, removing herself from the toxic environment that Derek's harassment had created. Her departure represented the loss of the most competent employee Tony had ever hired, someone whose work had maintained professional standards that he had taken for granted. "Maria, please," Tony pleaded during a phone conversation that she had reluctantly agreed to accept. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. Derek was just trying to have some fun, and things got out of hand. Come back to work, and I'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again." But Maria's response revealed that she had moved beyond the immediate circumstances of her confrontation with Derek to consider the broader implications of what had been revealed about Iron Fist's culture and values. "Tony, I appreciate the offer, but I think it's better for everyone if I move on to something different." Derek's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of attitudes that go much deeper than one person's ignorance. The conversation ended with Tony's growing realization that he had lost more than just a competent employee. Maria's departure represented the exodus of someone whose quiet professionalism had maintained standards that kept Iron Fist operating at levels that its official instructors couldn't match. Through their more visible contributions, Jenny Rodriguez became increasingly frustrated with the gym's response to the incident, particularly Tony's attempts to minimize Derek's behavior and frame the confrontation as a mutual misunderstanding rather than systematic harassment that had finally provoked a defensive response. Her conversations with other female fighters revealed that Derek's treatment of Maria had been part of a broader pattern of gender-based hostility that made Iron Fist an unwelcoming environment for women. "This isn't about one bad day," Jenny explained to a gathering of female fighters who trained at various gyms throughout the city. "This is about a culture that tolerates harassment and dismisses women's capabilities until someone proves them wrong in ways they can't ignore. Maria shouldn't have had to defend herself from someone who was supposed to be a professional." The discussion led to the formation of an informal network of female fighters who began sharing information about gyms that maintained respectful training environments versus facilities where gender-based harassment was tolerated or encouraged. Iron Fist quickly developed a reputation as a place where women trained at their own risk, leading to a significant decline in female membership that further damaged Tony's already struggling business model. The investigation into Maria's background intensified as more people within the boxing community began recognizing similarities between her demonstrated technique and archived footage of legendary fighters from previous eras. Social media detectives compiled comparison videos that highlighted technical similarities that were impossible to dismiss as coincidental, building compelling cases for connections that official sources refused to confirm or deny. The breakthrough came when a retired boxing judge named Edward Sullivan recognized Maria's defensive movement patterns from fights he had officiated during the height of Lightning Lopez's career. Sullivan had worked dozens of professional fights involving top-level female fighters, developing an expert eye for technical details that separated elite performers from talented amateurs. "I've seen that slip-and-counter combination before," Sullivan explained during an interview with a boxing podcast that specialized in historical analysis. Lightning Lopez used to destroy opponents with exactly that technique. The timing, the precision, the devastating effectiveness. It's like watching archived footage come to life. Sullivan's credibility within boxing circles gave weight to speculation that had previously been dismissed as internet conspiracy theories. His detailed technical analysis of Maria's counter-punching technique provided evidence that convinced many experts that they had witnessed the emergence of someone whose capabilities operated at levels that few current fighters could match. The insurance implications became relevant when Derek's legal team began exploring options for financial compensation related to his damaged reputation and compromised career prospects. The viral nature of the footage had made him a target for ridicule within boxing circles, potentially costing him future fights and endorsement opportunities that represented millions of dollars in lost revenue. But their investigation into Maria's background revealed complications that made legal action increasingly problematic. If she was indeed Lightning Lopez, as growing evidence suggested, then her hands were technically insured weapons whose use in combat situations fell under specific legal frameworks that protected both fighters and institutions from liability claims related to professional violence. The insurance policy that had once protected Lopez's hands contained clauses that specifically addressed situations where her knockout power was used in self-defense or response to harassment, providing legal immunity that extended to any venue where such incidents occurred. The coverage had been designed to protect both Lopez and her opponents from the financial consequences of her devastating capabilities, recognizing that her power represented genuine danger that required special legal considerations. Derek's legal team discovered that pursuing compensation claims against someone whose hands were insured as weapons would require proving that she had initiated the confrontation rather than responding to systematic harassment that multiple witnesses could document. The viral footage clearly showed Derek escalating the situation at every opportunity, while Maria attempted to avoid conflict until self-defense became necessary. The revelation about the insurance coverage also explained why Maria had been so reluctant to reveal her capabilities during the weeks of harassment that preceded their confrontation. Using insured hands in combat situations triggered reporting requirements that would have immediately exposed her identity and destroyed the anonymity she had worked to maintain since retiring from professional boxing. The psychological impact on Dara continued to worsen as the story gained national attention through sports media outlets that recognized the broader implications of the incident. His upcoming fight was postponed indefinitely while his management team attempted to repair his damaged reputation and restore his confidence through intensive therapy and retraining programs. But the damage appeared to be permanent in ways that threatened to end his professional career before he had achieved any of his championship aspirations. The fear of being hurt by unexpected counterpunches had infected his fighting style with hesitation that made him vulnerable to opponents who would have been easily defeated during his previous incarnation as an aggressive knockout artist. Maria's transformation from invisible cleaning lady to viral sensation forced her to confront decisions about her future that she had hoped to avoid indefinitely. The anonymity that had allowed her to serve quietly while processing the grief and guilt that had driven her from professional boxing was no longer possible to maintain, given the level of public interest in her true identity. The phone calls began within days of the incident as promoters, managers, and television executives reached out with offers that reflected their understanding of the revenue potential represented by her dramatic return to public attention. The comeback story of Lightning Lopez, the legendary knockout artist who had disappeared from boxing following personal tragedy, represented the kind of narrative that could generate enormous pay-per-view revenue and mainstream media coverage. But Maria's responses to these overtures revealed that her priorities had evolved during her years away from professional competition in ways that made traditional comeback scenarios unappealing regardless of the financial incentives involved. The tragedy that had driven her from boxing had taught her that some forms of success came at costs that could never be justified by any amount of money or recognition. "I appreciate the interest," Maria told each caller, "but I'm not looking to return to professional competition. I've found other ways to contribute to the sport that don't require putting myself or others at risk for entertainment purposes." The refusal to capitalize on her viral fame frustrated promoters who understood that her story represented a potentially lucrative opportunity that might never arise again. But Maria's commitment to her new life reflected a maturity and perspective that had been earned through experiencing losses that redefined her understanding of what truly mattered. The long-term impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence broader conversations about gender, respect, and the nature of expertise within boxing culture. Maria's demonstration of superior technique had challenged fundamental assumptions about female capabilities that were embedded throughout the sport's traditional power structures. Gyms across the country began reevaluating their policies regarding harassment and discrimination, recognizing that the viral nature of Derek's humiliation had created a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating people based on gender, age, or employment status. The incident had provided a dramatic example of how prejudice and ignorance could lead to spectacular failures of judgment with career-destroying consequences. The story of Maria Santos would become legendary within boxing circles, serving as a reminder that true expertise often traveled in disguise, and that respect was something that needed to be earned through behavior rather than demanded through position or reputation. The simple woman who had been mocked at the boxing gym had taught an entire community that appearances could be deceiving, and that the most dangerous opponents often emerged from the most unexpected circumstances. Her legacy would live on through every fighter who learned to treat training partners and gym staff with the respect that all human beings deserved, and through every instance where someone chose to demonstrate their capabilities through actions rather than words. The insurance money that had once protected her hands had become relevant again, but this time as evidence of expertise that commanded respect rather than fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit, The mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.